Simply understand the Second Vatican Council, in 9 points. Copie traduite en anglais de comprendre simplement le Concile Vatican II en 9 points. https://udo.b/ruisfomis. Hello, we are in July 2019. My name is Arnaud Dumouch and I am a Catholic theologian. I live in Belgium, and next from me there is Mathieu Lavagna, who is, one could say, who is a student of theology and excellent in theology, who has a theological sensitivity perhaps complementary with mine, and we would like to approach together Vatican II, a kind of balance sheet of Vatican II for the following reason. Currently on the internet, very actively cites, and I would say, traditional sensitivity, Matthew if you want, we call traditional or fundamentalist. How would you define this sensitivity? Traditionalist, so very close to a rigid Thomist. I do not want to use the word fundamentist because integrist, it comes from integrity, and I think that we are all called to be honest in our faith, so I reject this appellation of fundamentalist employed by the goodpensance and the media. I prefer to describe the Society of Saint Pius X. I would say the more specific term is schismatic, even if there is a rapprochement since Benedict XVI had lifted the excommunication, and well, if not the sedevacantists who reject outright the Pope as valid. That's it, but I prefer traditionalists or sedevacantists as integralists. That is, except that the panel of traditionalists is great because I consider myself traditionalist, but completely faithful to Vatican II, completely in the line of Pope Francis. It seems curious because obviously what we see developing is a certain tendency to oppose the authentic magisterium of Pope Francis, who has practiced little in dogmatic matter, very, very little, but who by against developed, what might be called, the need for a pastoral theology, with some implications that we will tackle together. And for my part, I really think that the Second Vatican Council should be regarded as indicated by Pope Benedict XVI. That means in continuity with all the other councils, to know that there is a deep unity there within, a continuity, and this is what we would like to approach, but our difference in sensitivity will allow to understand a little bit your generation, which is that of the 20-year-old who goes up, who take the church by 30, 40 years, my generation, which is, I would say, at special because one can say that I am a little unique, not a majority in any case, because those of my age are rather in a trend, one could say those which are a little older, a tendency to break up, that is, to exalt Vatican II and say that the councils before are councils of eras, I would say obscurantists of the Church, and that Vatican II would have everything put on feet. I am not in this line at all. For me everything came from the Holy Spirit for specific reasons. So first question, Matthew, is the Vatican Council too true, only a pastoral council? As some say. So it's false, it's an insured person that we could have, because Pope John XXIII had this intention at the beginning of the council when it started in 1962, he really intended to act at the pastoral level in the Church, but the Pope who followed, Paul VI, gave it a true doctrinal dimension with extremely important dogmatic and theological contributions. So in this council we have at the same time pastoral texts and texts which have a doctrinal character, and concerning the other councils it is more difficult to detect if it is pastoral or if it is of the Ignatian doctrine, because that there is no very precise anathema canon as we had from Nicaea to Vatican I, and here it is up to theologians to read the texts, which are sometimes a little bit wordy, a little long, to try to determine which ones concern really faith or morals, therefore, which engage infallibility in fact, and so, that is what we will do with Arnaud, a little repeating these points, the pastoral points and the doctrinal points which the Council has brought. So precisely I found 8, Matthew has found one more, we basically roughly at the level of the universal doctrine of salvation, it means what could be called the dogmatic, even if alone one, it seems to me, it is I who affirms it. Only one has a solemn form. The rest is ordinary magisterium, although some have said, it is still an ecumenical council, so in fact, the simple and ordinary form, because it is an ecumenical council, makes it all the same solemn dogmas. So 9, which summarizes the Second Vatican Council and which seems to me it will allow to understand the contributions of this council. I had published them on the internet. We find them on the site Belgicato, and how would I say they were very criticized by a person, I think, member of the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, and that suddenly, made all complex while I wanted to simplify. That is to say, by challenging each point on legal terms with extremely important canonical nuances, that is not what we want to do. It really shows that it's simple to understand, it must be simple necessarily, it must be harmonious. And so, Matthew, start with the first, we'll do the 9 the first that seems to me is a dogmatic contribution. So here, the first is indignitatis humani, is to say that man is by nature a free being and that religious freedom is a condition of its nature and is part of its fundamental rights. So we could say again that it's a new preamble of faith, that's it. Yes, in fact, it is an obvious truth from the philosophical point of view that we are people, we are not animals, therefore determined by something rigid. Why did the Second Vatican Council remind you? Well, it's very simple. It is that there were in the 19th century texts or popes said textually, we will analyze it, we will discuss it that religious freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly is an aberration. A total aberration that would lead, I would say, to the dissolution of salvation, to the dissolution of manners, to the dissolution of Western thought. That's it, and that can be found in the syllabus, for example, of Pius IX or in the encyclicals of St. Pius X, Leo XIII, that's what condemns a little religious freedom. These are the objections often heard within the Society of St. Pius X and even among the sedevacantists, that is to say we see that Vatican II, at one stroke, produced freedom religious, and these people have the impression that there is a break between the teaching of popes who preceded the 19th century and Vatican II precisely. And it is factual, if a proposition, religious liberty is a condition of human nature etc., is in perfect contradiction with its inverse says a century rather, it is that there is one of them which is in falsity. Say for example the sedevacantists, who conclude with precision and logic that from the death of Pope Pius XII, there is no more Pope, there was something that happened, then that there are many explanations. Some say that because the secret of Fatima had not been published, the Virgin Mary, Queen of the Church, decided that the popes were no longer valid, in short, lots of things like that. I say no, there is a precise explanation. There are no contradictions because it is not at all at the same level of analysis. Well, then maybe Matthew you have your opinion on it. First, after I will give mine. So it's true that we cannot deny that it's part of human nature to be able to reject or accept God. So religious freedom is intrinsic to our human nature. On the other hand, the way in which it is formulated in Dignitatis Humani's text, if I remember correctly, could have liberal interpretations. This is what theologians like Hans Kohn had in the 60s and 70s, and in fact, for example, the freedom of conscience that is very much linked to religious freedom, some exalted the freedom of conscience that is in the texts of the Council, but then it would be necessary to define to what extent it is a freedom of conscience. For example, we do not have the freedom in conscience to abort. The conscience must be enlightened by grace by the Holy Spirit. To say freedom of conscience, yes, but that is a pastoral clause which was made after the Council. The Pope must clearly define what the Church means by the freedom of conscience, and therefore we have fallen into a liberal interpretation, either among the faithful or with certain priests who have not been able to explain it well. Absolutely. That means that in fact, the non-Catholic interpretation is not from Vatican II, but from what I would call the generation of May 68, that may not be the case. Is to show, let's say, the post-war generation, which was born in the years 1945, and that was to say religious freedom is fundamental, so all paths lead to salvation, everything is worth, Islam, Buddhism, etc. Suddenly, the consequences were in chain. What is the point of evangelizing? It is called proselytism, since in any case everything leads to salvation and everything is worth it. So that's not a Catholic interpretation, it's a falsification of the Second Vatican Council. I will give what I think is the authentic interpretation with the popes, to show that there is no contradiction. First, yes, it is true that we are human persons, and therefore that inner freedom is a condition of our nature, to the point that, when we will face our judgment, individual, at the hour of death, God will to give it to us, so that the people who are in hell freely choose at each moment something which seems to them the supreme good, namely the love of themselves, their freedom of thought, etc., and God respects them. That's an authentic interpretation. It means that they are people God will not force to love. If someone, while God has tried everything, refuses, he will end up agreeing. C is your choice. That being said, when one goes to God, this freedom of conscience is enlightened by what the Church gives light. This consciousness must be enlightened, otherwise it does anything. As for the document of Pius IX, at the time of the 19th century, it is to say this: it is from a pastoral point of view, it means not to define what it is that human nature, as Vatican II, but from a pastoral point of view to say this. If you allow any text to be published, for example the texts that say that Jews have a crooked nose, that they are subhumans and that we can slaughter them, you will see that all kinds of ignoble thoughts will develop and that will lead to misfortune. And what Pope Pius IX announced came true. That means that from the political point of view, the absolute freedom to publish everything, to debate everything, to say everything is an aberration, and we are in agreement now because laws even said that we could not talk like that publicly on the internet by calling for the killing of certain types of people, etc. So it is clear that Pope Pius IX is right, his pastoral is quite valid, and that from a point of view of universal doctrine it does not prevent that man is a free person and that his freedom of consciousness is a fundamental property of its nature. What do you think, Matthew? This is exactly to avoid finding contradictions where there are none, and to make an effort of interpretation in a perfect hermeneutics of continuity, as Benedict XVI said, and not a hermeneutic of rupture. That's it. On the other hand, one criticism that is valid is that some say yes, okay, very well, Vatican II is dogmatic, Pius IX, pastoral. But Vatican II also has pastoral consequences. He says that, from now on, the index of forbidden books is removed, people are allowed to debate everything, we stop anathematizing, etc., so we enter a pastoral ministry of freedom to meet among Christians. Can read Luther's works without problem and discuss them, etc. Yes. There really is a pastoral break. That we cannot deny, but, I will defend this pastoral break. We can now imagine a 12th century pastoral ministry, that is to say that Christians would be forbidden to read a huge list of books. Would it work? No. The Catholic Church, taking into account that people have changed, that people are more cultivated, that people have access to everything, decided to proceed with a pastoral that is the one used by Jesus, namely that the shepherd is in front of the flock, he speaks, that the shepherds hear his voice and follow the flock, but, consequently, there are sheep who do not hear the voice at all and who will be lost. Indeed, the criticism of fundamentalists who say, look, many people disappear, stop practicing, go into ideologies and validate them, there is no possibility otherwise, it seems to me. Would you see, Matthew, another pastoral possible? Like the 12th century? Oh no, right now it's hard because banning books in a Western society where people read a lot, cultivate more than before, it's complicated, people would take it badly, it would be a kind restriction of freedom. So we can see that this pastoral can no longer be kept and that we have to adapt it, and then we have to always find the right balance, because we can have the impression that those who interpreted the council said we were completely free to do anything we wanted, and even at the level of freedom of conscience there were really abuses, and people left the council saying that there is, since Vatican II we can make free use of our consciousness and therefore we can abort in conscience, we can use contraception in conscience, do not obey the doctrine of the Church in matters of morality and morals, and this is where we fall into a true liberalism at the level morals and faith. And yes, so there for once, I will also formulate a criticism. We know that the Church and the popes are not infallible in pastoral, in the application of pastoral care, pastoral theology follows, their Pope Francis emits one, there is one, it is infallible. But in the application not at all, there is no protection, and here we can say that Pope Benedict XVI has just released a document, which is very important, about the great crisis that arose in 2019, that is to say, pedophile priests who have been allowed to do so, who have sometimes become cardinals, and then other things like that which have actually arisen from the 50s, 60s, etc. Here Pope Benedict XVI is very precise. He says, the defenders, those who were to defend the people of God in relation to these abuses, and those who also had to defend the people of God in relation to what is faith, have not done their work, by applying a pastoral in a lax way. This means that it was not hard to say that this thought is not in the Catholic line, it is not valid. Well, at one point, we said it for certain people, for example, we remember Bishop Galliot, etc., but that was not said enough. We let it happen, etc. under the pretext of tolerance, whereas before we did the opposite. There was obviously a passage of Charybdis and Scylla according to the pastoral that allowed people settled in church posts to destroy the faith. I say it well. For example, university professors say, you know, the resurrection is symbolic. Hey, really he is not resuscitated. Obviously it's because it symbolizes that the victory of love yet, etc. That's been said, these teachers stayed in place. There we had to defend the faith, and suddenly, as we did not defend that, well, manners too, we let it go, well there was a sexual abuse, and well we did as everywhere we moved. Sanctioned a little bit and there was avoided the scandal, there were pastoral mistakes, but it is not in Vatican II. It is because of a generation that pastorally applied Vatican II in a fallible manner. That's exactly